Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and in this video we will be covering the topical MCQs for consumer surplus. If you are new to my channel, I would want you to please click the subscribe button and press the bell icon as well so that you can get the regular updates. And now let's get started. The diagram shows a consumer's demand curve for a product, and you have a demand curve given, your different prices and quantities given. The question says, how does a consumer surplus change as the price of the product rises in $5 steps between 5 and 20. So between $5 steps means that it is each time the price is going up by $5. So 5 to 10, then for 10 to 15, 15 to 20, and so on and so forth, right? So now we know that whenever the price goes up, the consumer surplus goes down. And consumer surplus is, we know that is the difference between what the consumer is willing to pay versus minus what it pays. Is the consumer welfare, the extra welfare the consumer gains by consuming a certain quantity, right? And so basically over here you can see, so by the way, the economic theory says that whenever the price will go up, the consumer surplus will go down. And remember that whenever the price goes up, the consumer surplus goes down, but not only goes down, it goes down by a decreasing amount, right? It goes down by a decreasing amount. And so for instance, let's say if this is your demand curve, and let's say this is your price, so all this area is your consumer surplus, this triangle, right? And let's say that the price goes up, and so let's say the price goes up, and if the price goes up, then this shaded region is the decline in consumer surplus. But let's say the price goes up further, and the price goes up again, and now you can see that the consumer surplus goes down. Obviously it has to go down, but this shaded region, the size of this shaded region is much less. So you see that the consumer surplus is going down, but then it's going down by a declining amount. And let's say it goes up again, so again the consumer surplus goes down, but it goes down by a decreasing amount. So obviously the size of this region is much less than the size of this region. So each time the consumer surplus is going down, it's going down by a decreasing amount when the price goes up. So the rule is that when the price will increase, the consumer surplus will go down, but it will go down by a decreasing amount. And I'll tell you the reason behind it. I mean, I could do the math here, but I think that's not really required. But I'll tell you intuitively, and that is that what's happening is that as the price is going up, so as the price is going up, basically, right, what's happening is that the consumption is going down, right? So the reason is that as the consumption goes down, the quantity consumed approaches the origin, that is 0, right? And so fine, the welfare declines, but then each time less is consumed, the quantity of that decline in welfare is going less as well because of the decline in the quantity that is consumed, because the consumption is approaching the origin, right? So that's one way to sort of intuitively make sense out of it, right, guys? So the answer should be it falls by a decreasing amount. And by the way, and the opposite will happen if the price goes down. The price goes down, the consumer surplus will go up, but it will go up by an increasing amount. And I want to write both these rules. It will increase by an increasing amount, and you can see for yourself that, let's say that you can see from here as well, that if your price was going down, so initially if this was your consumer surplus, now this would be your consumer surplus. If the price goes down, then each time the price is going down, the consumer surplus is going up. So let's say the price goes down, this is your increase in consumer surplus. The price goes down further, then all of this extra region is also gained, right? This is your consumer surplus. The price goes down, all of this extra region is gained as well. So again, your consumer surplus is going up. So each time so as you're going down the curve, right? So your quantity is increasing, and the reason why the consumer surplus is going up by an increasing amount, the reason for it is it's going up by an increasing amount because you're moving away from the origin. I mean, you're moving away from the origin in terms of quantity means that your quantity or your consumption is going up. So the welfare is going up, but each time it goes up by an increasing amount. So that's the intuition behind one way to think about why this logic exists, right, guys? Okay, so the next question basically says that in the diagram, D is a demand curve for Indian tea exports and S1 is the initial supply curve. The Indian government removes the tax on tea exports, which causes the supply curve to shift to S2. Obviously, the cost is going down, so the supply has to go up. This diagram measures the resulting loss in tax revenue to the Indian government and the resulting gain in consumer surplus, right? So let's see which would represent the loss in tax revenue. So the supply curve is shifting outwards here. So let's assume that, let's basically sort of reverse it, and let's see what happens if a tax is imposed. So let's say if a tax is imposed, then the quantity will go down to Q2, right? Because S2 will move to S1 now. And so we know that the distance between these two supply curves represents the tax per unit. The vertical distance between these two supply curves, which is the extent by which your marginal cost, and supply curve is your marginal cost curve. It represents the cost of producing an additional unit. It reflects that, it factors that. So the supply curve is shifting inwards parallel by the amount of the tax per unit, since the marginal cost is going up by that extent. And so what we conclude is that since this is the tax per unit, and if you multiply it by the number of units, you get a total tax revenue. So your tax revenue would be the tax per unit times the quantity that you're selling, right? So you're selling OQ2 units. So this distance is reflecting the quantity that you're selling, which should be equal to this distance. So obviously then this entire rectangle is reflecting your total tax revenue, X plus Y. So if you're selling OQ2 units, then the government's total tax revenue would be X plus Y. But now if you remove if you remove those taxes, your quantity falls to OQ1, and so does the entire tax revenue goes down by that extent. So the tax revenue will fall by the extent of, it will be minus X plus Y, as in simply it will decline by X plus Y simply. So the answer has to be either C or D, right? So you cross out A and B. And so the gain in consumer surplus would be, so the original consumer surplus was how much? The original consumer surplus was this entire triangle, right? And now since the price goes down, the gain would be X plus Z. This is reflecting the gain in consumer surplus as the price goes down, X plus Z, right? So the answer should be D. Okay, so next question says the diagram shows the market for computers in Pakistan. What can be concluded about the value of the consumer surplus? It is less than producer revenue. It is less than producer surplus. Okay, so this saying, what can you conclude about the value of the consumer surplus? So consumer surplus is basically equal to what you are willing to pay minus what you actually pay. So your willingness to pay minus what you actually end up paying, and what you pay is the price. So let's say if you're willing to pay $10 versus the actual price that you end up paying is $7, so your $3 is your welfare gain, your consumer surplus, the extra welfare that you gain by paying less than what you were actually willing to pay. Now the price that you pay is expense for you, but it's revenue for the producer, right? So the $7 is the price you pay, but it's also revenue for the firm. So you see that mathematically the consumer surplus, which is $3, is less than the $7 in producer revenue, right? So the answer option has to be A, it is less than producer revenue. It's a simple question, just twisting and playing with your mind. Okay, so the next question says, question number 4. It says a well-known clothes retailer decides to have a summer sale in its shop. As a result, the number of people who use the shops increases. Obviously, you have more customers when the price goes down. So which area measures the change in consumer surplus? The change in consumer surplus, okay, for the customers who would have bought the clothes anyway, and the surplus for the new customers. Okay, so this is an interesting question. Before I move on to this question, let me explain to you that, as your demand curve is basically reflecting your sort of willingness to pay. So, when your quantities are lower at, lower quantities, closer to the origin, you have those people with the higher ability to afford higher prices. And that's why we see that, only those people who can afford a higher price end up buying that quantity. But obviously that quantity is less than the quantity that would have been had the price been lower, because more people would have ended up entering the market and buying those goods. And that's why we see that at lower quantities, if the price is higher, we see that the amount of goods that are being bought is less as compared to the quantity that is being purchased at lower prices, because now more people end up buying it, right? And that's simply the law of demand. And so it follows that if the price is going down, it obviously means that the consumer surplus is going up. But then some of the consumer surplus is going up because now the old people who were originally buying the product at a much higher price, and they were willing to pay a high price for it, now experience a further gain in welfare. So for example, if let's say if I can afford something and I can pay a price for it, and I can pay a high price for it, and let's say that the price for it goes down, so obviously my surplus will go up. And because I was already willing to pay a high price for it, and now since the price is going down, I can now sort of even witness a higher consumer surplus now. And because of that lower price, some more people, maybe my friend who was not able to afford, maybe he enters the market and he sort of now is able to buy that product, right? So some of that consumer surplus would also exist because new people are flooding in and entering the picture. So what it follows is that now the total increase in consumer surplus is area K plus area L, and we're already aware of that. Area K plus area L is the total increase in consumer surplus, right? And let's say this is 500. Let's say this is 500 chocolates that were being sold at a price of, let's say, $1, right? And let's say these are 500 chocolates, and let's say these 500 chocolates are representing 500 people now, right? Let's assume that. So it follows that the consumer surplus for 500 people at a price of P1 would be area J. And if the price goes down, right, now the same 500 people, if the price goes down, now you witness 700 chocolates being sold, or we could say 700 people end up buying the chocolates. So we have 200 more people who end up buying those chocolates at a lower price at an after sale price of, let's say, P2. So it follows that the area K is representing the consumer surplus that is gained by those 500 people who were already willing to pay a higher price for, and they were also okay with the fact that paying P1, and still they were having a consumer surplus at P1 as well of area J. But now as the price goes down, they witness a rise in consumer surplus for area K as well, right? While area L reflects the consumer surplus that pertains to those people who have now entered the picture because the price has gone down, right? So it pertains to those new people who are able to afford these chocolates at a much lower price because now the price has gone down, right? So area L is reflecting the consumer surplus that is gained for the new customers, for the new people who have entered the show and entered the picture because now the price has gone down. So that consumer surplus attributes to those people, right? So C should be the answer. Existing customers area K, new customers area L. Now moving to question number 5, it says a government imposes a specific indirect tax on a product. When will the tax cause the greatest reduction in consumer surplus for the buyers of the product, right? So you see, the greatest reduction in consumer surplus would occur when obviously the maximum burden of the tax falls on the consumer. So the greatest reduction in consumer surplus would be when you have the most burden actually falling on the consumer, right? And so if we know what would cause the maximum burden to fall on the consumer, we would automatically have the answer to this, right? And for that reason, I have sort of added a few things I want you guys to know. First of all, I want you to know the difference between a specific and the ad valorem tax. And so, while specific tax causes a parallel shift, the ad valorem tax would cause the curve to sort of swing upwards. And what this means is that when you have a specific tax imposed, the tax is the same for all the levels of prices, which means that irrespective of the price, whatever the price is, if the price is higher or lower, it would have the same tax in it, right? So you have a fixed sum per unit sold. So you have a fixed tax amount, and that causes a parallel. That is why you have a parallel shift, right? So if you have a specific tax, it would cause a parallel shift. So let's say if your supply curve is this, if S is your supply curve, if this is your supply curve, so your specific tax, so it will shift to S plus specific, that is a parallel shift, while an ad valorem tax would cause your supply curve to sort of swing upwards like this. And that is why at higher quantities and at higher prices, you see that the gap between the two supply curves sort of opens up, as in the gap increases. So if you have this sort of a supply curve, and then an ad valorem tax would cause an inward supply to sort of shift inwards like this, as in swing upwards, basically. That's the correct terminology for it. And so why this happens? It happens because, and ads, obviously when the price is zero, so an ad valorem tax is basically a certain percentage of the price of the good. So let's say a 10% tax on the price of the good, right? So every time you're producing more, you're adding more value. So it's a percentage on the value of the goods. The value is reflected in the price. So what happens is that, as you start producing more, if this is your supply curve, right? And so if this is your supply curve and you start producing more, your cost is sort of going upwards like this, right? And the higher cost reflects a higher value of the product, right? And so the price obviously reflects, the price itself is reflecting the value of the product. And as your cost is going up, so is the price of the product going up, because obviously, the higher price needs to be, the higher price reflects a higher marginal cost of the product, right? And so when you end up imposing a tax on, let's say, the good with a higher marginal cost reflecting a higher value, you end up with a greater value or a greater absolute amount of the tax. And that is why what happens is that the parallel distance opens up. The parallel distance, the distance basically opens up, or the gap opens up as at higher quantities and at higher prices, right? Because the fixed amount is imposed, or fixed percentage is imposed of a higher value, right? So basically, so this is so over here you can see the vertical distance is reflecting or representing a higher tax value. So at higher quantities and higher prices, you would end up with a higher tax value. At lower quantities and lower prices, you would end up with a lower tax value. And this is basically your ad valorem tax, right? So there's no tax at zero price, and hence there's no supply shift as well. But as the price goes up, the gap between the original and the new supply curve widens up, because you're applying a given percentage. Is when the given percentage is applied on the prices, and basically the price reflects the marginal cost. It reflects that value of the product. So if it results in a larger absolute amount, the higher the price, and so the gap would open up, right? And so basically, this word ad valorem, this word that is used, ad valorem, this is basically, it comes from a Latin word, which, it's a Latin word basically that means according to value, right? According to value. So the tax is basically here, the ad valorem tax is calculated based on the value of the item that is being taxed, right? And now, basically, if you want to know that whether the burden falls more on the consumer and the producer, so you need to understand that, if you want to know that whether the tax burden would fall more on the consumer or the producer, so the tax burden would fall more on the consumer. That is, there would be a higher consumer burden of the tax and a lower producer burden of the tax if your demand is inelastic and or supply is elastic. So if your demand is inelastic or your supply is elastic, it could be and as well, as an inelastic demand and elastic supply, or inelastic demand or elastic supply. Whatever the case is, your indirect tax burden would fall more on the consumer rather than the producer, while an indirect tax burden would fall more on the producer rather than the consumer when you have an elastic demand, right, or an inelastic supply, or an elastic demand and an inelastic supply. And you can actually take the screenshot of this of these graphs as well, that shows that when your demand is inelastic, you can see that the pink shaded region is reflecting a higher consumer burden of tax, right? While you can see if that your demand is elastic, you have a more producer burden of the tax reflected by the green region. And so if your if your demand is elastic and or supply is inelastic, you have a more producer tax burden bearing the tax. While if your demand is inelastic and your supply is elastic, you have a more consumer basically burden reflected in. The consumer is bearing the more tax burden because obviously the producer would transfer the tax burden on the consumer that is reflected in the price of the product. So the answer to this question would be that when will the tax cause the greatest reduction in consumer surplus? Like I said, it would be when the most of the tax burden falls on the consumer. And when would this happen? This would happen when the product has price inelastic demand and price elastic supply, just like I mentioned in this rule over here, right? So the answer is C. Moving on to the next question. It says the table shows the maximum amount 3 students would be willing to pay for a taxi to take home from a nightclub. Assume they share the taxi fare as shown below, which shows how much each should pay so that they obtain the same consumer surplus. So Jane is willing to pay $10, Sarah $8, Yasmin $6, and we need to sort of have the same consumer surplus. So this answer is basically going to be solved using the elimination method. Not the elimination method, sorry. We need to check out the answer options. It can't be A, obviously, because if Yasmin pays $6 and she's willing to pay $6, so there's no consumer surplus, so just cancel out A. So it can't be 4 either. It can't be option B either because all are paying the same amount, so the consumer surpluses would be different in this way. So either it has to be C or B, right? So C or D, sorry. So it seems like D because obviously, these values are too close to each other and these differences are quite high. So the answer should be D because 10 minus 6 is $4 is the consumer surplus, 8 minus 4 $4, and 6 minus 2 $4. So you see the consumer surplus is consistent in option D. And consumer surplus is simply the willingness to pay minus what you actually end up paying. So if Jane is willing to pay $10 and she pays $6, so the consumer surplus is 4. And let's say Sarah is willing to pay $8 and she pays $4, so the consumer surplus is 4. So it was a pretty simple question. Moving forward, we have question number 7, which says the diagram shows the market for computers in Pakistan, which area represent consumer surplus and consumer expenditure. So if X is the price, then the consumer surplus would be the triangle W, X, and Y, while consumer expenditure is simply price times quantity. So this box would be the consumer expenditure. This area is reflecting the expenditure that is done simply to buy OZ units, and so it's simply OXYZ is the consumer expenditure, while WXY is your consumer surplus. So B is the answer. Okay, so question 8 says what is meant by consumer surplus. Okay, I'm skipping this because this is very, 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 very simple. You can do it yourself. Question 9 says in the diagram S1 is the original supply and demand. Okay, so if the supply curve shifts to S2, which area represents a change in consumer surplus? So the price is going up, the consumer surplus has to fall. So at a price of P, this big triangle was your consumer surplus, right? And now if the price rises, then your consumer surplus is this triangle, which is triangle WTV, right? So we can see that your consumer surplus is going down by this region, right? Which is simply PQVT or whatever the alphabets, in whatever order the alphabets are arranged in the answer option. So it's PQVT. It's A is the correct answer. This is representing a fall in consumer surplus. And now, guys, moving on to the next question. It says the table shows the price Rashid is willing to pay for successive bottles of water, and 4 bottles of water he has bought, and it's representing the price that he is willing to pay. Obviously it will go down each time he buys more water. The price he's willing to pay goes down because obviously the marginal utility for additional bottles of water is going to go down. Now if the price is $0.5 and Rashid buys 4 bottles, what is the monetary value of Rashid's consumer surplus? Now consumer surplus is simply what you're willing to pay minus what you pay. So for the first bottle of water, he's willing to pay 0.9 minus 0.5, that gives 0.4. For the second bottle of water, 0.8 minus 0.5, that gives 0.3, and 0.65 minus 5, 0.65 minus 0.5 gives us 0.15, and the consumer surplus would be 0 here. So if you add all this up, the answer should come to 0.85. So the answer should be B, right? Question number 11 says, at first, a television service is available at no charge, and the television company then charges viewers $6 per hour to watch its programs. And the demand curve is given below. So let's say this is an individual demand curve. Let's say it's my demand curve, which represents how many hours I'll view the service, the channels at different prices. So what is the value of the loss in consumer surplus, and what value of consumer surplus remains after the introduction of the hourly charge? So it's just asking us to tell us the value of the consumer surplus not before, but the remaining consumer surplus and how much is lost. So first we need to find what is the consumer surplus without the charge. So without any charges, what is the consumer surplus? So obviously, now if you look at the demand curve, right? If you observe this demand curve, so if obviously the price is $0, right? So $0 is charged, then what is the maximum hours that I'll view what is the maximum number of hours that I'll view the service or the channel? So it's 5,000 hours, right? So this demand curve is reflecting that. So now we know that remember that the area under the demand curve shows, the number of, it shows basically how much am I sort of willing to pay for, the units that I'm buying. And the willingness to pay is also my total satisfaction that I'm, going to gain. So let's say, right? So the area under the demand curve, let's say, is the total amount of satisfaction that I will gain from consuming a certain quantity, which is actually equal to, how much in total would I be sort of willing to pay for all the units that I'm buying, right? So it follows that this entire red triangle, right, the area under this triangle is reflecting the, my willingness to sort of pay for in total amount that I'm willing to spend, for viewing these 5,000 hours, although it's free of cost for me, but still is going to reflect that, which will reflect my total satisfaction as well that I'll gain by consuming, 5,000 hours, right? My total utility that I should gain, right? And so for instance, if you calculate the area of this triangle, which is mathematically it's half base times height, so half into the base, let's say this is your base and your height is 10, so 10 into 5,000, so the answer to this should be $25,000. So it simply means that I was willing to pay $25,000 to view these 5,000 hours. I was willing to pay $25,000, which means that I was obviously getting a satisfaction of $25,000 if we monetize that willingness to pay. But I ended up paying nothing for it, $0, right? So it means that, so it follows that all of this is my consumer surplus then, if I'm paying nothing, right? So this follows that the area under the demand curve is my willingness to pay and the total satisfaction that I'll gain by consuming the number of units that I would want, whatever quantity that I'll buy, right? And so this is my previous consumer surplus. So now if $6 is charged, right? $6 is charged. So how much is the total consumer surplus that I would, that will, result by paying $6 and buying and watching 2,000 hours only? Because now if I'm paying for it, then I'm only going to watch 2,000 hours then, right? And so it follows that this triangle is reflecting that consumer surplus, right? And like I said, the area under the demand curve shows how much I'm sort of willing to pay and my total satisfaction that I'll gain. And so it follows that this region is reflecting how much I should be willing to pay for watching the 2000 hours, because it will reflect how much the satisfaction or the utility I'll gain by watching these 2000 hours, right? And so basically this region is my consumer surplus then. So it means that if I calculate the area of this triangle, it should be half times 2000, because this would be 2000 and this would be 10 minus 6, 4 times 4, and the answer should be 4000. So 4000 should be my consumer surplus after this charge is imposed. So remaining consumer surplus should be 4000, so the answer should be A or C. And if my consumer surplus without the charges is 25,000, after the charges it's 4,000, so how much have I lost? I've lost $21,000 of consumer surplus that I was gaining previously by paying nothing, right? So the answer is C, right? And like I said, the area that is under the demand curve is reflecting how much you're sort of willing to pay. And like I said, if you're watching 2,000 hours and you're gaining a surplus of 4,000, which is reflected in this region, right? And if you add this triangle and you add this rectangle up, so it's basically the triangle and the rectangle is giving you the total area, is reflecting how much satisfaction you're gaining or your total willingness to pay, right? And so this rectangle here, basically if you want to calculate this area, so it would be 2000 times 6, length into breadth. So 2000 times 6 would give you 12,000, right? So 12,000 is basically your total willingness to pay for watching 2,000. Sorry, 12,000 plus 4,000. 12,000 plus 4,000, that is 16,000, is your total satisfaction that you're gaining in terms of monetary value by watching 2,000 hours of television, right? Or taking this service. But you end up paying how much? I mean, you're willing to pay 16,000 because that's your total satisfaction, but you end up paying only 12,000, which is your total expenditure, price times quantity, right? And so it follows that 16,000 minus 12,000 is 4,000 of consumer surplus, which is your additional welfare. By paying 12,000, that is less than 16,000, and you're gaining an additional welfare of 4,000. So that's why this triangle 4,000 is coming. I mean, this shaded region is reflecting that additional gain that you're having by consuming 2,000 units of or 2,000 hours, right? So anyway, so this was just an additional information, but C is the correct answer. Okay, so the next question says, in the diagram, D is the country's demand curve for an imported good. The government imposes an tariff equal to PWPC. Equal to PWPC means that this vertical distance is representing the tariff on the good, right? So the tariff per unit, basically. So this is your tariff per unit. Which areas measure the resulting loss in consumer surplus and the gain in government revenue? So obviously tariff is an import tax, so it's the amount is gained as government revenue. So initially, if the price was PW, I mean you were buying, let's say, Q1 units, and if the price goes up because of the tariff, the demand goes down to Q2. So OQ2 is the quantity that you will end up purchasing. So this distance is equal to this distance, and this is your tariff per unit. So this is your tariff per unit. So if you multiply this box is representing the total tariff that you will pay when you purchase OQ2 units. And so this represents the government revenue, right? So the gain in government revenue is X. So it should be either A or C. And obviously, if the price goes up, your quantity goes down. So the resulting loss in, consumer surplus is basically X plus Y, right? So that makes B the correct answer. Now, moving on, the next question says, what is necessary for consumer surplus to be zero? And consumer surplus is zero when your demand curve is perfectly elastic. So, I mean, if you have a perfectly elastic demand curve, that is a horizontal demand curve like this. So a horizontal demand curve basically means that it indicates that the consumers will only buy at one specific price. So whatever quantity they will end up buying, they will buy it at $10, right? So each additional unit would be bought at $10. So so if the price goes up, right, if at higher prices, it simply implies that at higher prices, more than $10, the quantity demanded would be zero. And at lower prices, the quantity demanded would be infinitely large, right? And this implies that consumers are extremely sensitive to price changes. So what this means is that the consumers are only going to buy at $10, which means that what consumers are willing to pay, they will actually pay that price. So the willingness to pay is equal to the market price. So your willingness to pay equals the actual market price, right? So if let's say, if what you're willing to pay is equal to the price, so you don't have any consumer surplus then, right? So so I mean, intuitively, if you look at it intuitively, I mean, imagine a market for a commodity like wheat, right? With a market price, let's say we set it at $10, and the consumers will only buy wheat at this price, not even a cent more or less. And if the price goes up to, let's say, $10.01, demand would drop to zero. And if the price drops to, let's say, $9.99, right? I mean, $9.99, then what will happen is that theoretically the demand would be infinite. But practically, the market will not sustain an infinite demand, right? So therefore, we say that at $10, every consumer's willingness to pay matches exactly the market price, leaving no consumer surplus, right? So when the demand is perfectly elastic, consumer surplus is zero, because consumers do not gain any extra utility from purchasing the good at a lower price. I mean, they don't gain any extra utility from purchasing the good at a price that is lower than their maximum willingness to pay. So they pay exactly what they are willing to pay, leading no additional benefit represented as consumer surplus. And that explains why your consumer surplus is zero when your demand is perfectly elastic. So A should be the correct answer. Question number 14 says a local government decides to issue a card for residents that gives a 50% discount on entry prices to visit the museums. The demand, so you have a demand curve. So currently you have 3 museums. 50% reduction would mean that the price falls to $1, and so your consumer surplus should go up by, if the price is going down, so X plus Y is representing the increase in consumer surplus. Simple question, simple answer. 14 should be boy. Question 15 says the diagram shows the supply and demand for bananas. What happens to consumer surplus when the price increases from P1 to P2? So the consumer surplus should fall, and it decreases from P1 VY. This was your initial consumer surplus. It decreases from P1 VY to P2 VW. So it falls from, so now this small green triangle is your consumer surplus. So it's basically falling by this shaded region. Simple question. So the answer should be boy. The next question says, what is most likely to cause an increase in consumer surplus in the market for a normal good? Normal goods are those goods whose demand rises when your income goes up. So, for normal goods, the consumer surplus would go up definitely when you have an increase in consumer incomes, because it would cause an increase in demand and a shift in demand, and demand represents your willingness to pay. So when the demand curve shifts outwards, your willingness to pay, demand curve shifts outwards, your willingness to pay goes up as well, right? And it would mean that your consumer surplus would go up because now you're willing to pay more, right? That would cause an increase in consumer surplus. And the rest of the answer options are pretty straightforward and incorrect as well. It's quite obvious that they're incorrect. Look for yourself. An increase in number of substitutes would mean that your demand would become more elastic, and the more elastic the demand is, the less would be the consumer surplus, because the less would be the willingness to pay, right? And an increase in the price of a complementary good would shift your product's demand inwards, and hence consumer surplus would go down, because as demand shifts to the left, your willingness to pay goes down, and that causes a reduction in consumer surplus. Increase in the price of a good also causes a reduction in consumer surplus. So A is the correct answer. Okay guys, so moving on, question 17 says the diagram shows the outcome when a landowner who has allowed motorists to park on his field at no cost introduces a parking charge of $1. What is the loss of consumer surplus that results? Okay, so you have a demand curve, you have a supply curve given. Now let's see that what would happen if, let's say, you have, ample amount of space that caters all the possible demand at different prices. So let's say if you have $0 and let's say you have this demand curve. So at $0, how many cars could be parked? Let's say this would represent the quantity of cars that would be parked, and it could be anything. So let's say this is Q1. So if this is the case, then it means that the area under the demand curve represents the amount of utility that you gain by parking the cars at it, by paying nothing for it, and hence it follows that it represents the utility gain or the willingness to pay for those cars. So if you're willing to pay for those cars but you end up paying nothing, so all the area that is under the demand curve is your entire consumer surplus, right? This is your entire consumer surplus. Now what happens is that, let's assume that this would have been the case if, there was no limit to the amount of cars that you could park. But obviously we have a limit. So let's say that, this is your supply curve S, and which means that obviously you can only end up parking how many cars? You could end up parking, let's say, QA cars only. Right? And you're also charging a price now, and you have an equilibrium price of $1, right? And so it follows that, if you want to find out the consumer surplus, so you need to first see what is so if let's say you were still not paying anything for, charging QA car. I mean, you're not paying anything for, parking QA cars. And so let's say that, you're charging $0 for QA cars. So if you were charging $0 for QA cars, then your consumer surplus would be it would represent what you were willing to pay for that, or the utility that you were gaining by parking QA cars over there, and the consumers who were satisfied by parking the number of cars. So this would represent this area, whatever it is. Let me see the alphabets there. It's X and Y, right? So X plus Y would represent the consumer surplus had no fee been charged. So right, so at zero fee, at zero charge, the consumer surplus was basically X plus Y, right? Because you weren't really charging anything. So all the area that is under the demand curve is your consumer surplus. Now you're charging $1, so now the consumer surplus is only this triangle, right? And so the consumer surplus after the charge is only X, right? So it falls by, the difference is what? Falls by area Y. So this consumer surplus is now foregone. It's gone now, right? It's just wasted. So what is the loss of consumer surplus that results? So the loss of consumer surplus should be CY only. Moving forward, question 18 says the price of a ticket is 50. All tickets which area represents. Okay, so this is a simple question. The answer would be C, because this is the consumer surplus. You can see it for yourself. Nothing for me to explain. Question 19 says in the diagram, D is the demand curve for Indian tea exports, and S1 is the supply curve, and there's a tax on tea exports. The Indian government removes the tax, which causes the supply curve to shift to S2. Which areas in the diagram measure the resulting loss in tax revenue and the gain in surplus? So obviously you're removing the tax, so the price has to fall, which will obviously, this was the initial price, the price goes down to P2, and so the gain in consumer surplus would be X plus Z, right? So the answer would either be B or D, and you can cross out A and C, and the gain in tax revenue would be the distance between the two supply curves would represent the tax per unit times the quantity, times the quantity that is sold. But since this has been the removal of the tax, so we could just sort of see that what would happen if a tax was imposed. So if this is your, if this is your new quantity after the tax is removed, and this was your original quantity, let's say that your quantity moves in the opposite direction. Your tax has been imposed, and the quantity goes down from Q1 to Q2 because of an imposition of a tax. So in that case, the gain in tax revenue would be this vertical distance would represent the tax per unit. This vertical distance would represent tax per unit times the quantity, which is OQ2. So OQ2, this distance would exactly be the same as this distance, and this difference would represent the price per unit, and hence the area, this rectangle, X plus Y would represent the tax per unit had an indirect tax been removed. And so we could reverse it by saying that if X plus Y was the gain in tax revenue, but if you're removing those taxes, so the quantity, goes down from Q2 to Q1, and hence that initial gain in tax revenue is now removed, right? So you don't gain any of this anymore. So loss in tax revenue would be X plus Y, and gain in surplus is X plus Z. Okay guys, moving forward to the next question. Question 20 says an indirect tax is imposed on a product in a competitive market. Under which circumstances would the value of consumer surplus be the most likely to remain unchanged? So basically when your indirect tax is imposed, obviously your consumer surplus has to go down, right? It will go down. But the question is asking what would happen out of these four things, that would cause the consumer surplus to remain unaffected, which means that consumer surplus in these four options might have to increase in order to set off the decline in consumer surplus so that it remains unchanged and moves back to the original position. So what has happened is, the problem is that the consumer surplus has gone down, and our target is to bring the consumer surplus back up. Now I want you to focus on the target, right? The target is to bring the consumer surplus back up. If you look at option A, it says new substitutes are developed for the product and the production cost rises. So if the production cost will rise, your always supply will fall, which will increase the price, and that will cause a decline in consumer surplus. So it will basically, so again, our target will not be achieved. Some products merge, so there's less competition. If your competition declines in the market, that monopolizes the market, that creates the potential to increase prices, and that again means consumer surplus will not decline. Option C says the product is an inferior good, consumer incomes increase and production cost rises. So if consumer incomes are going up, right? So if consumer incomes go up, your demand should increase, but since it's an inferior good, whose demand decreases when consumer incomes go up, so demands will fall. And when demand falls, your willingness to pay falls. When your willingness to pay for something is going down, it will decline your consumer surplus. So consumer surplus will go down, and production costs will rise. Again, a rise in production costs will increase the price of the product, again causing a decline in consumer surplus. So in option C as well, your consumer surplus is declining, and we want to bring the consumer surplus back up. So option C is correct. That leaves us with option D only. Hence, option D is the correct answer. But let's see why is option D the correct answer. Option D says the product is a normal good, consumer incomes increases and production costs fall. So when consumer incomes would increase and the product is a normal good, the demand will go up. And remember that whenever the demand goes up, the willingness to pay goes up. And if I'm willing to pay something more, irrespective of whatever the price I'm paying, irrespective, it will drive up the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus will be higher here, right? So the consumer surplus will increase, and production costs fall. And if the production cost is gonna fall, right, again that will cause the prices to go down, and that will cause an increase in consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is going up, right? So because of both these options, they are reinforcing each other, and the overall effect of the consumer surplus is going up. So this will ideally, most likely, set off the decline in consumer surplus, and hence the consumer surplus will go back up again, right? So option D is the correct answer in that sense. Next question number 21. The diagram shows the demand curve for a Okay, so this is the same question we have solved earlier as well, so I'm skipping this. Question 22 says, what example of a consumer behavior would create consumer surplus? Okay, so consumer surplus, so the answer option would be B, because consumer would end up paying less than what they are willing to pay. So that's the gain in welfare and the consumer surplus, right? Question number 23 says the table shows the maximum price a consumer would be willing to pay for successive cans of fruit juice. So you have different prices given for 5 cans, and the market price is $4. And here the price is reflecting what you are willing to pay. So for the first can, you're willing to pay $14, and you pay $4 only. So 10 is the consumer surplus. For the second, the consumer surplus would be 6. For the third, the consumer surplus would be 2. And for the fourth, there won't be any consumer surplus. So when you have already finished 3 cans, your total consumer surplus is 10 plus 6 plus 2, which is 17, 18. $18 is your consumer surplus. On the fourth can, you don't gain any consumer surplus, so there's no consumer surplus on the fourth can. So how does buying the fourth can affect the consumer surplus? It doesn't have any effect, frankly, because the consumer surplus is the same on the fourth can and the third can, so it leaves it unchanged. So A is the correct answer. Question number 24 says, what would cause an increase in consumer surplus in the market for a good? Okay, so they've given increase in demand for a good and an increase in supply of a good. So first of all, remember that whenever the demand goes up, you are willing to pay more. So obviously your consumer surplus has to go up. So yes, when your demand goes up, your consumer surplus would go up. And when your supply goes up, your cost of production is going down, and right, so your producer surplus is going up as well. But then because of a rise in supply, your price goes down, and that also has an impact on consumer surplus, because the consumers would end up buying more quantity now, so consumer surplus would go up as well. So the answer option should be D. But do remember that your consumer surplus is the difference between what you're willing to pay minus what you actually end up paying. That is what you're willing minus what you pay. So if what you're willing to pay goes up, that will obviously have a rise. Your consumer surplus will go up, right? And so and obviously if your price goes down, your consumer surplus will still go up. But when your demand goes up, basically, right, a demand is your willingness to pay. So your willingness to pay curve is shifting outwards, right? So you're willing to pay more, so your consumer surplus goes up. But some of the consumer surplus is lost as well when demand goes up, because because of a rise in demand, the equilibrium price shoots up, and that causes some consumer surplus only to lose out as well. But the overall effect is that your willingness to pay is increasing by a greater extent, right? So your overall consumer surplus will go up as well. And let me actually show you on a diagram as well, so that you can sort of have more clarity on this. So let me erase this first. Let's make a demand and supply diagram, this is your demand curve, supply curve, and we are shifting our demand curve to the right. Let's say we're outwards. So this is D1, D2, S1. This is the original price, and this is the new price, and this is our quantity, and this is our quantity after the rise in demand. So you have Q1, Q2, P1, P2. Now, if you see, the original consumer surplus would be, when you're buying Q1 units, was how much? It was this triangle, right? It was triangle A, B, and C. So all of this triangle was your initial consumer surplus, right? And when demand goes up, right, your new consumer surplus would be, and the price goes up as well. So your new consumer surplus would be this triangle. It would be this triangle. And obviously we can see from the diagram as well, this triangle is bigger than this triangle. Let me change the colors. So this triangle is obviously bigger than this particular triangle, right? And what we see is, so let me label this as well. So we can call this, let's call this A prime, and we can call this B prime, and we can call this C prime, right? So your initial consumer surplus was ABC. This was before, and now your new is A prime, B prime, and C prime, right? So what you see is that so what you see is that you're gaining a lot of consumer surplus, right? You're gaining all this entire area, which there was no, because this area was not part of consumer surplus before. But you're also losing some area as well, and you're losing out this part of consumer surplus, right? You're losing out this part of consumer surplus. That is, you're losing out this part, right? This part of consumer surplus is gone, and this part of consumer surplus is gone because of a rise in price, right? But if you think of it intuitively, if you want to sort of see whether your overall consumer surplus what is a net effect, is that your consumer surplus is going up, because if you come to think of it intuitively, your demand is going up, which means that consumers are now willing to pay more money. They're ready to pay more money, right? And so the willingness to pay more is going up by a greater extent than what the market price is rising, right? And so what we sort of, what we see is, and if we sort of try to, and let me also sort of give you another way of explaining this as well, that, your demand, if you see this vertical distance between this demand curve, look at this distance between the two demand curves. So this is the vertical distance between these two demand curves would be giving you intuitively the extent to which you're willing to pay more, because this is the shift in demand, right? And this distance is bigger than the increase in price, right? Which is this red distance, the extent to which the price is going up. So what you're willing to pay more is more than by the extent to which the price is going up. So overall consumer surplus has to go up, and you see, there are so many ways to explain this. Your demand is going up, and your quantity consumed is going up as well. So definitely your consumer surplus overall has to go up, right? So that is the intuition behind it. So don't just rote learn things, try to understand it as well. So an increase in demand for the good would definitely increase your consumer surplus, and also and this is pretty easy, because increasing the supply would decrease the price of the product, which would cause an extension along the demand curve, causing an increase in consumer surplus. So D is the correct answer then. Okay, so moving to question number 25, it says, when will the price mechanism not function as a system of allocating your goods, basically? So first of all, you need to understand what the question is saying. So the question is saying that we know that the price mechanism is basically the method or the function of the price to allocate resources through altering demand and supply conditions accordingly, right? And so through its four functions, through of incentivizing, rationing, allocating, and signaling, right? And in order for the price mechanism to perform effectively, I mean, there should be no barrier on the demand and supply forces, in the sense that there shouldn't be any barrier on the prices to go up and down, to move freely up and down. Otherwise, they will not have any effect on demand and supply then, right? And so, your effective allocation will not take place, or maybe not at all. So so the answer to this question is B, because if the government maintains an effective maximum price, so let's say if you have a maximum price below the equilibrium, so let's say this is your maximum price, and we know that maximum price would result into a subsequent shortage, right? And if this was a free market, or a free market economy, where there's no government restrictions on the prices to move freely up and down, the price mechanism would have ultimately restored this equilibrium, because there's a lot of tendency for change to take place right now. There's a lot of tendency, or there's a lot of room available for demand and supply to change accordingly, because you have a shortage right now, so it will obviously signal an immediate signal will be sent to the producers something is wrong. I mean, there's more demand than supply, which will and ultimately the prices will start rising, incentivizing producers to encourage production. And as the prices would go up, it will also ration the shortage out, ultimately restoring equilibrium at this point where the price would be, the price would go up to P1. Ultimately, will restore the equilibrium via an contraction in demand and an extension in supply. And that's what the price mechanism is. But if you impose a effective maximum price, it means that the price cannot go up than PM, as in it cannot increase more than PM. So it will always be, it will always be P max then, your maximum price. So effective resource allocation will not take place in the context that the shortage will persist in the market then. So that's what makes B the correct answer. Okay, moving on. Question number 26. The diagram shows demand and supply for a good. If the price rises, what will happen to consumer surplus? Okay, very easy question. The price is going up, so consumer surplus was initially A, B, and E, and it falls to A. So it falls from A, B, E to A, so A should be the correct answer, okay? Question 27. What is meant by consumer surplus? Now, this is a repeated question. You can do it for yourself as well. You don't need me for this. Question 28. The diagram shows the demand and supply of tickets for a music festival. And if the tickets are priced at P1, it is anticipated that the demand will be Q1. So if this is the price, then the demand should be Q1. So that's how you sort of solve it, and you put your pens and move it across the diagram so that you can sort of comprehend the diagram as well. So then there is a discount for those that buy tickets in the first hour who pay P2. All tickets are sold in the first. So obviously you have limited tickets. That's why your supply curve is vertical. It's showing that you have fixed number of tickets. And so if you buy the tickets in the first hour, then the market price for those tickets will be P2, and P1 will not be the price then. And they're saying that assuming that all these Q2 tickets are being sold in the first hour, so it simply means that the price is P2 then, right? So they're saying how much would the consumer surplus would go up, right? So the consumer surplus would go up by this extent if the price is P2 instead of P1. So it's P1, X1, X2, P2. Such a simple question, but they have just sort of made it so difficult and sort of given you a scenario. Again, a very easy question. So they do twist things like that. P1, X1, X2, P2. So it's right here. And I think that also finishes our MCQs. And so that's it, guys. I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed. Do let me know in the comments. And if you have any further queries, you can ask me down in the comments below. See you. Take care. Until then, next time.